Welcome everyone to the webinar. This is how to remember more of what you read. I want to thank you for joining us. My name is Paul Novak. I'm the founder and program director here at Iris Reading, and I think you'll find this webinar very, very helpful. This actually is one of the most popular webinars we've ever done. Actually, we've had a few thousand people register for it. So thanks for coming. I think you'll find this very helpful. We've got a lot to cover in a very short period of time. So let's discuss what we will be covering today. And that is how to read and remember technical materials. So that includes textbooks, that could be reports, things that are difficult to read, dense, lots of information. There are ways that you can read through that material and remember it a lot better than most people do. And also, the technique that we'll go over for approaching technical material will also help you read it a little faster. We'll also discuss how and when to take notes. Obviously, this is a webinar dealing with memory and how to remember information. What's the best way to take notes? When should you be taking notes? Things like that. We'll discuss some memory principles to keep in mind and a specific memory technique that was actually used by the ancient Greeks to memorize information. I think you'll find that very, very fascinating, and you can use it in a lot of ways. You could use it to remember things that you read. You can use it to remember presentations. That's usually what I use this technique for. If you're not already familiar with the work that we do here at Iris Reading, we teach speed reading and memory courses to students and professionals. We've done it in over 30 cities across the US, and we're now doing them internationally. We're based in Chicago, and also we do these classes in person. So I know this is a webinar, but we also do live courses. So if you want to invite us on campus or to your company or organization, we'd be happy to do a class. You can reach out to me. I've got my email there. It's just paul@irisreading.com. I'll also have my contact information at the end of the webinar displayed. And what we focus on is speed. Obviously, you want to read faster, but of course, comprehension is extremely important. If you're not understanding anything while you're reading quickly, then I wouldn't even call that reading. That's just skimming. So comprehension and speed are equally important. And of course, there's a third area, which is retention. What do you remember? And what you remember is a little different from comprehension. Comprehension is what are you understanding the moment you're actually reading the material. And of course, retention is what do you remember later on. And that could be 5 minutes later, it could be 5 days later, or a year later. I think all of us would agree, sometimes you could have really good comprehension and then totally forget everything. You ever have your mind go blank during a test or when you get called on in class? So we'll discuss, we focus on improving all three of these areas. And actually, the technique we're going to cover right now, how to read and remember technical information, this will help you with all three of these areas of reading: speed, comprehension, and retention. All of them are important to being an efficient reader. So how do we approach technical information? There's a 3-step multiple reading process. This is a strategy that will help you get through information more efficiently and will help you remember the information a lot better. So let me discuss what this is. The first step is a preview. This is where you would read the introduction and the summary to your information. Now, when I say introduction and summary, these are general guidelines. Here's one example of reading the introduction. You might read, this is the beginning of a chapter here. This is a Latin American history textbook. I would just read the introduction, this area right here, and this first paragraph right over here. So anything before that first section of text is what I would be reading. Now, you might have a different introduction. If you're reading your text, you might have something at the beginning that says executive summary, or it might say abstract if you were reading, let's say, a journal article. You might have, instead of it saying focus questions, it might say objectives, or it might actually say introduction. So the first step before you're reading through a chapter is reading the introduction and then moving on to read your conclusion. Now, in this particular textbook, they didn't have a conclusion that actually stated conclusion or summary. You just see this, it might be hard for you to see it on your screen, but it says achievements there. That is actually the last section of this chapter, and it continues on to the next page, but it's basically about 4 or 5 paragraphs at the end. So this is step number 1. If I was reading through this chapter, I'd be reading the introduction and summary. And again, this is a general guideline. There are some other things you could do during step 1. For example, what if you have to do the questions for homework? Well, I would read those questions right now. Even though I can't answer any of those questions right now, I want to read them right away so I know what is expected of me when I start reading this chapter. That'll make actually the process of reading a lot easier. So let's move on to step number 2 in this process. Step number 2 is the overview. Now, the overview, again, generally speaking, this is where you would want to get your main points. And the way that you would do that is by reading all the headings and or subheadings. Now, if you don't have any headings, you'd read first sentence of each paragraph. Now, why would you read the first sentence of each paragraph? Because first sentences tend to be main ideas. Now, it's either this or this. You don't necessarily have to do both of these. So, for example, if I go back to that textbook chapter I showed you earlier, this would be an example. So, overview, this can be a very quick thing that you do before you start reading. Just look at all the headings and subheadings. So, here's a little heading right here. This is a subheading of that section. If there were any boldface words on this page, I'd be glancing at those as well. So this is a very casual step where you're just flipping through your chapter, looking at headings, subheadings, even charts and diagrams, any pictures that you see, I'd be looking at those. I wouldn't try to analyze the diagrams or the charts, so I wouldn't get too detailed on this step. I would just read maybe the title of those charts or diagrams, or I'd be looking at the picture, getting a first impression of what those things are. The reason you're doing step 1 and 2 here, the preview and the overview, is so that eventually, when you start reading it, it'll be easier to read through the material. Now, if you don't have any headings and subheadings, there's another thing that you could do during step number 2. If you don't have any headings, then just read the first sentence of each paragraph. As you probably know, first sentences tend to be main ideas or topic sentences. And if you had text that didn't have any headings, if it didn't have structure where you have, boldface headings and subheadings, I would just read the first sentence of each paragraph. That gives me a good idea of what the chapter or the report or whatever piece of information I'm reading, what the information is about. Third step. This is kind of obvious. You just read the rest of the information. So in this chapter, I'd go back to the beginning, and since I already read the introduction, if I already read this and this during the preview step, I'm starting from here. Now, if you really wanted to read the introduction again, you can if you want to do that for reinforcement. Depending on your purpose, that might be a good idea. But if I could already remember what that introduction was about, I would just start from this section, and I would start reading through the chapter. In this case, this particular chapter, I believe there were somewhere between 20 to 30 pages in length. But think about what will happen on this step number 3. On step number 3, I know what to expect out of the chapter. It makes it a little easier to process the information when I start reading. And this whole process, actually, geometrically, I like to think of it as an upside down triangle. Here's what I mean by that. You're starting with the most general information, and then you're getting more specific as you go down. So during the preview, you're being very general. You're just reading the introduction and summary. You're not getting a ton of detail there, but that's okay because you're just starting out in the reading process. The overview, you get a little more detailed, but it's still somewhat general. You're looking at headings and subheadings, or if you don't have them, you're reading first sentences. This is all so that when you start reading the chapter, you'll be able to read it faster. Think about it. If you know what to expect, of course you'll go faster through the material. Now, you're not going to go like 10,000 words per minute, especially if it's technical information, but you'll be able to read through the information somewhat faster than you would have if you just went from beginning to end. Now, here's one of the biggest mistakes that students and also professionals make when they're reading through informational text. They read everything beginning to end, as if there is some rule written in stone that says, you have to begin on chapter 1, page 1, and just read page by page. You can't look ahead. There's no rule that says you have to do this. And actually, this is probably the worst way to approach informational material. Now, I understand if you're reading fiction, you might not want to, spoil the ending. So, and of course, there's no introductions and summaries to, fiction. When you're reading stories, you're kind of going in a linear pattern. That's fine. But the idea behind these first 2 steps, I like to think of them. You can think of them this way. What do you do before you play a sport or exercise? You stretch and you warm up. Why do you stretch and warm up? So when you play the game, you're playing at an optimal level. You can think of step 1 and 2 as the reading equivalent of stretching and warming up. Obviously, you're not going to be doing jumping jacks here, but you're getting your brain prepared for the information. And that actually helps you. Remember we said there's 3 areas of reading. There's your speed, your comprehension, your retention. Well, your speed is affected here because if I do these 2 steps and I know what to expect, I will read faster when I start reading on step number 3. Your comprehension is improved because, again, if I get familiar with the material, I'll understand it better when I start reading because I looked ahead and I know where we're going. And the third area of reading is retention. What you remember is largely based on repetition. That's what helps us remember things. I'll repeat that. Repetition helps you to remember. This is how songs get stuck in your head, right? Now, I'll bet there's a song that I could put on right now that you haven't heard in years, but you know the lyrics of the song. How does that happen? Well, it's because you heard that song over and over again. And there are other things, songs are inherently repetitive. There's the beat or the melody that repeats, the chorus repeats. If it's popular at the time, it was on the radio all the time, or you listen to it on your MP3 player over and over again. That's all that repetition. Now, when we're reading, we need some level of repetition to remember the information. And this is one way that you can get that repetition. Nobody wants to read a chapter 3 times just for the sake of repetition. But notice how we're getting 3 repetitions in this process, but we're not reading the entire chapter 3 times. We're being exposed to the information 3 times in different ways. Now, what else can we do to enhance our memory of the material while we're reading? Well, notes, of course, help you remember. Now, note taking, all of us have taken notes. And some people have questions about this, so I want to address it. One common question I get is, when should I take notes? And if you've ever bought a used college textbook, you've probably seen this, right? Or you've seen textbooks where you've got not just like pink highlighting, but also yellow and green. And it's just, this is obviously an example of highlighting gone a little crazy. How does excessive highlighting happen? Here's what happens. Someone's reading along in this paragraph and they're like, oh, you know what? That's really important. I'm going to highlight that. Then they read the next sentence and they're like, you know what? That's kind of important too. I'm going to highlight that as well. And then they read the third sentence, and it turns out this third sentence is the most important one, or way more important than the previous 2. So they highlight that again, or they choose, you know what, I'm going to use a different color now because this one's way more important. You see where this is going. Have you ever heard the phrase, when you get caught up in details, you lose sight of the big picture? This is what's happening when you're taking notes sentence by sentence. Instead, what you should be doing, if you're going to take notes, wait at least until you finish a paragraph. So I wouldn't take notes until I finish a paragraph, or one of the things I like to do is I'll wait until I finish a section, and then I'll say, okay, now I'm going to take some notes based on that. Now that note taking, it could be on a separate sheet of paper, it could be highlighting. Nothing's wrong with highlighting so long as you don't overdo it. If you highlight too much, that kind of defeats the purpose of highlighting. It dilutes the importance of it. So, and also keep in mind, you don't have to highlight entire sentences or paragraphs. You could highlight maybe just a word or 2, and that would remind you of what that paragraph or section was about. I'll give you an example. When I say the word Katrina, what's the first thing that pops into your mind when I say Katrina? For a lot of you, that might be hurricane. Now, if you know someone named Katrina, you might think of that particular person. But if this whole paragraph or section was about Hurricane Katrina and its effect on the city of New Orleans, I wouldn't be highlighting some eloquently written sentence or paragraph. I would just be highlighting or underlining or circling or writing on a separate sheet of paper, Katrina. So I know that that's what was being discussed. So keep this in mind when you're taking notes. Try to avoid doing it until you finish a paragraph or a section. Now, another question that's fairly common is, some people feel like they spend too much time taking notes. How much time should be allocated? I wouldn't spend more than 20% of the time, the time spent studying, no more than 20% taking notes. This is because you want to make sure that you're making progress through your chapter. You don't want to be taking notes constantly. I've dealt with some students that will study for 60 minutes and they spend a good 30 minutes out of that hour taking notes. That's probably more time than you want to spend. I wouldn't spend more than 20% of the time. And what that comes out to in 60 minutes, 20% of 60 minutes is 12 minutes. So no more than 12 minutes. And of course, note taking is important, but there's got to be some balance. You don't want to spend too little time or too much time taking notes. And also, whether or not you take notes kind of depends on your purpose. If you need to know something inside out, it's probably a good idea to take notes. If you just need to know it casually, you might not be taking notes. When I'm reading magazines to kind of keep up with the news, like The Economist, I'm rarely ever taking notes. But if I need to know something really well for work or for school, I will definitely be taking notes. Also, how should I take notes? Well, I remember in high school, I used to look at some of my notes and I would just find them useless because there was just no organization to it. So one option you might want to consider is something called mind mapping. Mind mapping is a very effective way of visually organizing your notes. And the reason why mind maps are effective is partially based on the name. Mind maps reflect the way your mind works a lot more than linear based notes. These are very linear notes, line by line. When you're taking notes in this kind of a manner, it's a little more, it's very nonlinear, it's very visual. It's kind of like a bird's eye view. If you're reading a textbook chapter, you might think of this first thing in the middle. This could be the title of the chapter. This could be the heading, the first, let's say, heading. And this might be subheadings of that first section. This might be the second heading, third heading. Now, by the way, if you were trying to organize in some sort of a order, I would just go clockwise with my mind maps. And if you like taking notes digitally, obviously a mind map can be done just by hand with a pen or pencil. But I like taking notes on my computer, and I would use one of these programs. There are two mind mapping programs that I would highly recommend. These are different organizations from Iris Reading, but they're very, very useful mind mapping programs. And by the way, Iris does not get any kind of financial incentives for telling you guys about these. I'm mentioning them to you because I actually use these personally. Xmind.net. Xmind is a great mind mapping platform, and the nice thing about it is it's completely free. I think they have a premium version, but the free version does a lot. I've had the free version for years, and I've been using it for a lot of things. This is a downloadable desktop program. Works on a Mac or PC. There's also MindMeister. If you like things like Google Docs and storing your information in the cloud, you might want to check out MindMeister instead. They have a free trial, and the difference between Xmind and MindMeister, MindMeister does require payment. I think it's $4.99 a month. But there's a trial involved with that. One of the benefits of MindMeister, and part of the reason why I use it, you can share your mind maps because they're web-based. You can easily share them with other people, and that helps with like collaboration. So you could use mind maps for brainstorming, taking notes, based on textbooks that you're reading. If I was, I'm not in school right now, but if I was in school, I'd have a mind map for every single chapter. That way, at the end of the term, at the end of the semester, I could look at my mind maps, and you could print them out to a single page and have that bird's eye view to review all of that information. Now, where would we take notes in this process? This is how it would look if you were taking notes while doing this multiple reading process. You'd preview the information. Of course, if you remember, that's reading the introduction and the summary. Once you're done with that, you'd take some notes. Now, after you're done with the preview, you move on to step number 2. This is the overview. This is where, again, if you recall, headings, subheadings, boldface words, or if you don't have them, you're reading the first sentence of each paragraph. And after you're done with that, you take some more notes. Now, notice we actually have, by this point, you would have 4 repetitions. When I say 4 repetitions, I mean 4 exposures to the material. Number 1 was just reading the introduction and summary. That was your first exposure. But then if you take some notes based on that, that's a secondary repetition or exposure. You remember the information a little better when you take notes. The third exposure to the material is now when you're reading the headings and subheadings or the first sentences. And then if you take the notes, now that's your 4th repetition in the material. Now, by the time you start reading the chapter, you've had 5 exposures to the information. And if you have a really long chapter, I wouldn't wait to take notes. I wouldn't wait until the end of the chapter because obviously you might forget some things. I would just take notes as things are notable. So just keep in mind, don't take notes on a sentence by sentence basis. Make sure you finish a paragraph or a section before taking any notes as things become notable. But this is how you would implement note taking within that multiple reading process. You preview, take some notes. Overview, take some notes. Read the material, and then take notes as things become notable. So I want to discuss some memory principles because one thing we've already been covering is repetition. And that's where the multiple reading process and note taking, that's how we can implement repetition into our reading without having to read chapter 3 beginning to end over and over and over again. Nobody wants to do that. I want to read the chapter once and I want to read it well. This is how you can do it. But what else impacts our memory? There's another very important memory principle, and it's known as association. Association is how we learn things. You associate one piece of information to another piece of information, and that's how you remember information a lot more effectively. Let me give you an example of and actually something that demonstrates how important association is. There's something psychologists call the Baker-Baker paradox, and the Baker-Baker paradox is this interesting little phenomenon. What they do in the study is they introduce a bunch of people to someone named Mr. Baker. Now, the people conducting the study want to see how many people will remember this person's name. Now, they don't want the people to know that's the purpose of the study. Otherwise, that would skew the results. People would write the name down, or they would put more effort into remembering the name than they usually do. So instead, everyone is told that the study is about something else, and halfway through the study, they're casually introduced to someone named Mr. Baker. Now, a few days later, they bring these people back, and they want to see how many people can remember this guy's name. Almost everyone forgets. And now that's not surprising, right? All of us forget names, right? But here's the funny thing. They take a second group of people, and they're introduced to the same guy, but instead of them being told his name is Mr. Baker, they're told instead that he is a baker. Now, here's the interesting thing. They bring this group back a few days later, and almost everyone remembers what this person does for a living. In the first situation, about 90% of the people forget this person's name. In the second situation, about 90% of the people remember that he was a baker. And this is why they call it the Baker-Baker paradox. Now, in one situation, it's hard to remember. In another situation, it's easy to remember. Why is this? Well, it's not really a paradox, even though they call it the Baker-Baker paradox. They know why it's happening. It's because in this situation, there's a different amount of remembering going on in the situation where you're told someone's occupation. And it has to do a lot with association, which is one of our memory principles. When you think of a baker, what do you think of? You might think of like how would you visualize a baker? Maybe wearing like a top hat, a little baker's hat, kind of like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Or you might picture a baker with an apron on or flour on their hands. You might think of bread, cakes. There are all sorts of associations you make to the occupation of someone being a baker. Now, think about this. How many associations do you make when you're told someone's named Mr. Baker? If no associations are made, guess what? You forget the information. And that's the importance of association. Now, visualization is also very important. What I mean by that is you're more likely to remember visual information than abstract information. Here's a really good example of it. You ever forget someone's name? All of us have, right? Sometimes you instantly forget someone's name. This can be very, very frustrating. But think about this. You remember their face, right? Or you're more likely to remember their face. And that is because the face is visual information. The name is abstract. It's just a grouping of letters, right? Now, the reason why this is important is because to remember things that are abstract, you need to turn them into visual information. And we're going to talk about how to do that in a moment here. But you need to remember that visual recall is much better than verbal recall. So, a word is not as easy to remember as some kind of visual information. So that's the importance of visualization. And one other very important memory principle is exaggeration. How well you remember something. You're more likely to remember something that's exaggerated, or things that are strange, things that don't make sense, or things that are out of the ordinary are much more memorable, right? For example, commercials are a great example of this. You ever watch, TV commercials? Like, for example, during the Super Bowl, some people watch the Super Bowl just to watch the commercials because they're hilarious. Sometimes commercials, maybe they aren't funny, but they're just weird, right? But why do advertisers and companies go through so much effort to make? Why doesn't Geico just have an insurance salesman in a suit and tie tell you, hey, give us a call. We've got really great rates. We'll save you some good money. Instead, they have a talking gecko, right, with an Australian accent, which to an American audience is a very, very unique accent, right? So keep all of this in mind. That is the power and the importance of exaggeration. So these are all very important, and we can utilize and leverage these principles. If we understand them, we can turn this into a memory technique. And I want to go over this, how to memorize information that you've read. Now, when I say memorize information that you've read, I'm not talking about word for word. That takes a lot more repetition. That's something that actors and actresses have to do. They have to memorize their lines. But when you're reading a chapter, if you're a student, you need to read your chapter and you need to remember the most important information and details. Maybe not word for word, but you need to understand the information and remember it well. I want to go over a technique that was used by the ancient Greeks. It's called the memory palace technique. And this is a very powerful way to memorize information. So here's how it works. You have to choose a location you are familiar with. For most people, this is their home, right? Or your apartment where you live. This could also be, however, your office. This could even be your campus at school. Let's start with the home. Let's take that as an example. What you need to do for this memory technique to work is you need to decide on an order of sublocations. So this order is going to be very unique to you. It wouldn't be the same as mine because you live somewhere else. For me, my order is, okay, the first thing is mailbox. The second thing is front door. It's basically a mental walkthrough of your home. After I come through my front door, the dogs that we have always greet me at the door. And then there's the closet where I'll put my shoes or hang my jacket. And then the hallway, which leads to the kitchen, and so on and so forth. You would create your own memory palace and your order of sublocations. Why are we doing this? It's because you're going to associate those locations to the things you need to remember. So you see in the green here, all these topics. Well, whatever topic number one that you need to remember, it has to be associated to whatever location number one is in your memory palace, in your home, let's say, if that was your memory palace. Location number two has to be associated to topic number two, and then you go on from there. Now, it's very important that your associations that you're making are visual. So, for example, whatever your topic is, you need to have a visual reference for that particular topic. Now, let me give you an example. First of all, to start this out, this is going to be unofficial homework for this webinar. I want you to determine at least 10 locations in your home. And you're going to basically start with number one. This could be the front door. For me, it's the mailbox. This could be the driveway. This could be something else. It could be maybe your garage. If you live, we're broadcasting here from downtown Chicago. Let's say you live downtown and you live in an apartment building. This could be outside of the building. Location number two could be maybe the doorman or the lobby of the building. Location number three could be the elevator going up to the hallway leading to your front door, and so on and so forth. You could get very specific with these, and these locations, for example, I showed you the locations I had before: mailbox, front door, dogs, closet. This is just an ordered walkthrough of my home. Now, actually, I was doing this workshop not too long ago in New York City, and one of the students there told me that, hey, you know what, because I gave them the example of, kitchen, living room, bedroom, and so on. And he told me, he's like, you know what, I live in a studio apartment. I don't have all these locations. Well, you can still construct a memory palace. Like I said earlier, it doesn't have to be located. If you've got a studio, you still have what leads up to the studio: the outside of the building, the lobby of the building, the elevator, the hallway, or the stairs going up. And then when you get into the apartment, even if you have a small apartment, you could say, all right, well, there's the wall on the left, there's the windows in the front, there's the kitchen. And within the kitchen, you don't have to use kitchen as a location. You could say, okay, the fridge, the microwave, the oven, things like that. Now, let me give you an example. Let's say you were reading a chapter about something that had to do with technology, and your memory palace is your home. And let's say these are your locations. One is mailbox, two is front door, and so on and so forth. What you do, if you had to remember, let's say these topics. Let's say topic number one is you have to remember they're talking about Apple. Maybe they were talking about Apple at the beginning of the chapter. The second section was about Amazon. The third section was about Facebook, Twitter, and Netflix. And let's say for some reason you need to remember this in that particular order. Now, you might need to remember it in that order if you're asked what was the chapter about. Or for me, when I have to remember presentations, I'll try to remember a presentation in a very specific order. So what you do is you come up with associations between these things. So the first one, I have to associate Apple and mailbox. So I would imagine myself maybe opening my mailbox and a bunch of apples fall out. Now, obviously, I would need to talk about the company, the technology company, Apple, but I'm just using the apples, the fruit, to remind me of that. And notice how we're using some exaggeration, like it's a little weird that apples would be falling out of my mailbox. That doesn't make any sense, right? But we're doing this on purpose because things that don't make sense, things that are weird, are always more memorable. Now, number 2, if it was Amazon. Now, Amazon, there are a number of visual references for Amazon. You could think of Amazon as in like rainforest. You could also think of Amazon as in, getting a package from Amazon, like this ginormous package you see right here. It could also remind you of other things. For example, Amazon, Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon. For number 3, if topic number 3 was Facebook, well, what's location number 3? For me, it's something, it would have to be associated to dogs. Remember how we said association is a very powerful memory principle and also visualization? Notice what we're doing here. We are associating dogs. Obviously, dogs have nothing to do with Facebook, but we're forcing that association so I could remember that that is in position number 3. So I would picture either a bunch of people checking Facebook or Mark Zuckerberg. Maybe Mark Zuckerberg is being attacked by my dogs. Hey, that's weird enough for me to remember it. So we move on to number 4. Now for number 4, the location is closet in my particular memory palace here. If I had to talk about Twitter, I'd imagine myself opening the closet and a bunch of birds fly out of the closet. That would be enough for me to remember. All right, topic number 4 is Twitter. 5 is hallway. I would just picture, maybe a flat screen TV in the middle of the hallway playing House of Cards or whatever Netflix show you want to be watching. But you get the idea here. You would keep on making these associations. And of course, you would review these associations. And you can utilize this memory palace technique to either memorize a presentation, or it could be to memorize, maybe these were the first 5 sections of my chapter. And I want to be able to recite this if I get called on in class. Or it could be something else. But you need to zero in on what is it that I need to memorize. And of course, you need to have your memory palace locations. These are just examples. You don't want to use these examples I gave you. You, of course, create your own memory palace. Now, here's where this memory technique is very versatile. If you had to deal with subtopics, let's say you had to talk about or remember that they talked about Amazon in section number 2, but you also had to remember maybe these 3 topics related to Amazon. Well, what you do then is you create some sublocations of the front door. So when you think of the front door, what are some areas of the front door? For me, I would imagine, there's the little window on the top of the front door, and then there's the peephole, and then there's the handle of the door. Those would be my 3 sublocations. So that's how you would handle subtopics if you had to remember them. Let's say, at some point on, how we only have 5 here. What if like number 7 was living room? What areas of the living room do you have? For me, it would be, I've got the large couch, there's the coffee table, the TV stand, and the small couch. I would go in a clockwise order. And if I had to remember 4 things, I would put a visual representation of one of those things on the large couch. The second thing would be on the coffee table. The third thing would be on the TV stand. The 4th thing would be on the small couch, and that whole room would have a certain theme of whatever it is I had to memorize for that particular location. So this memory palace technique is actually very, very powerful because you can utilize multiple memory palaces, and this comes in handy when you have to memorize information for something like finals. When finals week comes around and you have, one class, you have a final on Monday. On Tuesday, you've got another final. Or what if you have 2 or 3 finals in one single day? Well, you can utilize multiple memory palaces. One of them could be your home, and you create 10 or 12 or 15 or however many sublocations you need within your home. Another one could be your workplace, your office. Another sublocation could be campus, or it could be your friend's place, your other friend's place, mom and dad's, grandma's house, your uncle. All of these can serve as memory palaces. And the great thing about the memory palace technique is it relies on your ability to remember locations very effectively. Now, I do understand that sometimes we, get lost as far as our sense of direction goes, but generally speaking, human beings are pretty good at remembering location-based information, and that's why this memory technique is very, very helpful. And again, as I mentioned, it's been dated. It's been going back for a few thousand years. Unfortunately, this technique is not commonly taught in schools, and that's unfortunate. Part of the problem is, now compared to like thousands of years ago, it's very easy to store information on a hard drive, write it down. Pens, paper, and hard drives are all over the place. Back then, in the time of the ancient Greeks, you had to have a trained memory. So it was more important to understand how your memory works and how you could remember information. And this was a very common memory technique that was utilized. When would you utilize this? Only memorize after you're done reading. So don't try to memorize in the middle of a chapter when you encounter, what if you have to memorize something from a diagram or something else? You want to wait until you finish, and this would be like a step 4 in this process that we covered earlier. Now, if you like these memory techniques, we actually have an entire mastery course. It's a speed reading mastery course that goes into other memory techniques. This is just one of many memory techniques that are out there. And if you're interested in this course, just go to our website, irisreading.com/mastery, and I'll pull that up real quick so you can get an idea. If you go to this particular link, the webinars in this series, there's how to read groups of words. That'll speed up your reading. There's how to reduce subvocalization. That's that voice in your head. You know, when you're saying words in your head, that actually slows you down because you can only read as fast as you talk if you do that. There's other webinars in this series, such as how to remember more through spaced learning. This is another memory concept to help you remember things long term. There's a webinar on essential eye training. This is very important for learning speed reading. Also, learning to read and remember visually. This has additional memory techniques if you're interested in learning how to memorize maybe equations or a vocabulary. And there's a few other memory techniques in there that you can use when you have to memorize information. Keep in mind, the memory palace technique is just one of them. Also, how to sharpen your focus for increased speed. If you have trouble concentrating while you're reading, this is a great webinar to learn it. By the way, all these webinars are 30 to 60 minutes in length. So this is a series of 10 webinars. There's also high-speed comprehension strategies. How do you understand information going at a much faster rate? And if you read a lot, if you're trying to keep up with the news, this webinar is very helpful. The most efficient way to speed read the news. Webinar 9 in the series is advanced speed reading exercises. And number 10 is probably one of our most popular webinars, how to read a book in one day. So if you've got a stack of books you've been wanting to read, this will help you move through that information more quickly. Now, when we launched this series of 10 webinars, each webinar was $25. If you go to this particular link, instead of paying $250 for the whole package, you can get the entire package for only $50. So that's a special offer only on this link if you go here. We set this up specifically for people attending our webinars if they're interested in continuing to go more in depth in speed reading. So go to irisreading.com/mastery. That's a limited time offer, and you can check it out on the link you see on your screen. So let's do a quick recap of what we covered today. The importance of repetition. Obviously, you repeat to remember. We also talked about the multiple reading process, which is a process that includes repetition in it. We discussed how and when to take notes, and the memory palace technique. Again, one of a number of memory techniques that are out there. If you guys are interested in learning more, again, there's that follow-up course. You can go to irisreading.com/mastery. I would highly recommend that if you're trying to kind of optimize your reading speed and you really want to, reach your capacity. This will help you save a lot of time, keep up with all your reading material. If you guys have additional questions, you can submit them. We'll do a little FAQ at the end here today. But I've got my contact information on the screen. If I don't get to your question, or if you want to email it to me later, you can contact me directly. I want to thank you so much for attending this webinar. You're going to get a recording of this webinar within 24 hours if you want to pass it along or share it with anybody. But thank you so much for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.